While reading about the zone system in The Negative by Ansel Adams, I found that he eased us into the world of artistic exposure with a few other, less complicated methods to evaluate a scene. And it's good to know what they are, because that makes the reasons for using or not using the zone system much clearer. I realised that if you aren't using the zone system, you are using one of these other methods. Every digital camera or phone has a built-in exposure meter, and it reads the light that's reflected off an object. Ansel says the meter assumes it's reading an average scene. But what does that mean? Let's use Ansel's example of a checkerboard. If we've got an equal number of light and dark squares, and we use the default evaluative metering mode, we get an average exposure that looks about right. But if we have more dark squares than light ones in the scene, the incident meter is fooled. It thinks we're at a stop underexposed. And if we were using auto exposure, the camera would automatically double the amount of light it gathers. In other words, raising it a stop so it can compensate. It doesn't want a dark image, it wants an average one. So it tries to lighten the image to get an average result. With an auto exposure of the entire scene at once, we get what we're given, because the meter assumes the reading is an average scene. When the distribution is not average, the meter has no way in itself to compensate. We're using a single reading without considering how dark or bright parts of the image fall. Even though this may not be the method to use when you're making fine prints to show in a gallery, it doesn't mean it's necessarily wrong. Every picture I take on my phone uses the average scene method. It's fast, and though it might not make the optimum image, it's designed to avoid producing a disastrous one. If you've got a sensor with a huge dynamic range, especially if you're shooting in RAW, you still might get all the detail you need, even if that requires some extra time in post-production. Ansel says, modern equipment is of remarkable accuracy, but the process of determining the ideal camera exposure will always involve a considerable degree of judgment. Modern to him meant the handheld meter, and modern to us is our auto exposure on our phone, but his reasoning still holds true. Relative to making an automatic average exposure, we can greatly improve exposure accuracy by making a reading from a middle value within a scene. We're now moving from accepting the camera's guess at exposure to choosing one for ourselves. With this method, you've got two options. You can choose a middle tonal value from your scene to meter off, something about halfway between the lightest and darkest parts of the image. Nice if that exists, but in a case like this dark skewed checkerboard that doesn't have a middle tone, we can use a grey card for the exposure reading. The evaluative meter is not useful for this method. Instead, we need to use the smallest spot meter your camera offers, or you can go old school and use a handheld meter. In this case, I used ISO 400 and an aperture of f4. The grey card metered at about a 60th of a second, and that's what we had when the equal dark and bright square version of the board was there. So that's perfect. The scene that was too dark with the averaging method now looks like we expected it to using the middle value method. The main problem is that middle grey doesn't take into account the range of tones in the scene. In a low contrast scene, it's fine, but if you've got extremely bright or dark areas in the image, they might not render as you intended. We could clip the blacks in the shadows or blow out all the whites in the sky, all depending on exactly where you choose middle grey to be. Also, what if we have neither a middle grey value or a grey card? Ansel's next suggestion helps us out in that situation. Ansel said we could get an exposure reading for the darkest part of the scene that has detail in it, and another for the lightest part with detail. Then we set our dials to get an exposure that's halfway between the two. This is the averaging high and low values method. It's the little sibling of the zone system because we begin to account for the principal luminance of the actual subject instead of assuming that the range is average. Now we're purposefully placing end member tones and letting the middle value fall wherever it is in the middle. Whereas in the middle value method, we did that the other way around, placing a mid value and then letting the high and low values fall where they fall. Looking back at a lot of my landscapes, I used the high-low averaging method quite a lot without realizing it was a thing. Look at how when we're using the evaluative metering, that the meter changes not on the actual values in the scene, but on the proportions of the light and dark areas. The needle moves gradually as the proportions change. Instead, we can use spot metering to read the dark parts with detail and also read the light parts with detail. Then we set our exposure exactly between the two. Ansel said that this method is good for a literal interpretation of a subject, but the high-low average method still involves little or no intentional interpretation of the scene. I've not chosen an emphasis for this image. I've simply recorded it with as much detail as I can cram in. Ansel wanted technical perfection within the framework of personal visualization. That's where the zone system comes in. He describes the zone system as a refinement of the high-low average method, so that you can alter values deliberately according to your expressive visualization, all the way to the print. It makes more sense to me now that I see the shortcomings of these three quick and dirty exposure methods. Let me know in the comments below if you've ever used the high-low average method, and stay tuned to this channel because I'll follow Ansel Adams' instructions for the zone system in another video to see if and why it holds up in a digital world.